The nearest torch crackled loud enough to cast dancing shadows across Annie's dress, and she paused for a moment at the entrance of the great hall, letting the warmth of the flames reach her before taking her first step inside. The dress was deep forest green, embroidered along the sleeves with copper thread that her cousin Sella had stitched by candlelight over 3 weeks. Annie knew this because she had stayed up with her on 2 of those nights, holding the thread while Sella grumbled about twisted stitches and laughed at herself when she made mistakes. The dress was not fashionable by court standards. It had none of the white lace that lords' daughters wore, none of the reinforced corsets that noble women preferred. But every stitch had been placed with intention, and Annie had put it on that evening feeling something she rarely felt inside her aunt's walls: hope. The great hall of Castle Durin was too vast for any gathering to feel truly intimate, but the assembly of clans attempted the illusion with banners from each pack hanging between the stone columns, torches spaced at careful intervals, and tables arranged in a wide semicircle around a central floor where the alphas would present themselves and, when the time came, make their public choices. This was how it had worked in the kingdom for generations. The assembly was not merely politics. It was promise. It was blood recognizing blood before witnesses. Annie was 23 years old and had never been presented at any previous assembly. Her aunt, Lady Mora, had treated this as though it were a kindness. It is not yet your time. You are not ready. The court has no need to know you exist. But this year was different. This year, there was Cedric. Cedric Vane was the youngest son of Lord Vane, an alpha of middling status, whose pack controlled 3 villages along the eastern ridge. He was not remarkable in any particular way, brown-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy smile that made people feel comfortable without ever making them feel safe. But 6 weeks ago, in the quieter hours of a market morning, he had found Annie carrying a basket of herbs through the lower village and had walked beside her for nearly an hour. He had asked about her name. He had asked about her mother, who had died when Annie was 9. He had asked what she wanted from life, and when she answered honestly, "A place where I belong," he had nodded slowly and said, "I think I know what I want too." He had not made a formal declaration, but he had said enough, and Annie, who had grown up being told she was too plain, too quiet, too low-born for any alpha worth the name, had allowed herself to believe him. Her cousin Sella appeared at her side now, slightly breathless, her red hair escaping its braid in small rebellious curls around her face. Sella was 19 and sharp-eyed, and had an opinion about everything, which was something Annie had always loved about her. "You look beautiful," Sella said, touching the copper embroidery at Annie's wrist with one finger. "He would be a fool not to choose you." "He already said he would," Annie replied quietly. Sella's expression flickered, something between hope and caution. "Then let's go in before your aunt sees us standing here and finds a reason to send you back to the kitchen." They moved together into the hall. Lady Mora was already positioned near the center table, wearing a gown of deep burgundy that announced her status without requiring words. She was her late husband's widow, which gave her a seat among the lesser nobility, and she used that seat as though it were a throne. She had taken Annie in after her mother's death, not out of love, but out of obligation, and she had never allowed Annie to forget the difference. Every meal Annie ate in that house had been preceded by a reminder of what she cost. Every dress she wore had been a hand-me-down. Every year of her life inside those walls had been shaped by the understanding that she was tolerated, not wanted. Lady Mora saw her now, and said nothing. That silence was its own language. The assembly began with the formal presentation of the packs. Banners were lowered and raised. Lords stood and named their allegiances, the hall filled with the particular kind of noise that power makes when it is gathered in one place. Deep voices, the clink of ceremonial armor, the shuffle of boots against stone, the low, resonant hum of wolves who were not quite fully shifted, but never fully human either. Annie had grown up on the edges of this world, close enough to see it, too low to enter it. Tonight felt like crossing a threshold. She watched the room carefully, the way she had always watched rooms, noting exits, noting faces, noting who spoke to whom and who avoided whose eyes. It was a habit born from years of being in spaces where she was not quite welcome, learning to read the current before it pulled her under. Cedric was across the hall with his father and 2 older brothers. He had not looked at her yet. That was fine. She understood the protocol. Public acknowledgement would come at the choosing hour. The feast came first: roasted boar, dark bread, wine that smelled of blackberries and oak, and Annie sat beside Sela at one of the lower tables and ate carefully and spoke little and told herself she was not counting the minutes. "He keeps looking away from his father," Sela murmured at one point, nodding subtly toward Cedric's table. "Lord Vane has been speaking in his ear all evening." "That's normal," Annie said, "a father advising a son before a choosing." Sela did not sound convinced. She tore a piece of bread and chewed it slowly. Or a father redirecting a son. Annie did not answer. The choosing hour arrived with the ringing of a bell. 3 slow, resonant tones that silenced the hall more completely than any command could have. The central floor was cleared. The assembled wolves arranged themselves in the old way, packs together, alphas at the front, and the air shifted with something older than ceremony. This was instinct. This was hierarchy made visible. Lord Commander Aldrin, who presided over the assembly, stood at the center with his staff of black iron and called the names in order of rank. The higher lords went first. Each made his declaration or held his silence. Some named formal alliances. 2 named mates, one a woman who wept with visible joy, one who stood very still and straight and showed nothing at all on her face. Annie watched them both and felt the difference. Cedric's family was called midway through. She watched him step forward from his father's side. Brown hair, broad shoulders, that easy smile. He was looking at the floor in front of him, not at her. She told herself that was still fine, that he was nervous, that he would look up when it mattered. Lord Vane said something quietly to his son. Cedric nodded once, and then he spoke clearly enough for the half of the hall nearest him to hear. "I wish to name Petra Aldrin as my chosen." Petra Aldrin, the Lord Commander's niece, a woman with a proper dowry, a proper bloodline, a proper pack name. The hall did not go silent, because no one there had been listening for Annie's name. Only Sela had been listening. Only Sela made a small, sharp sound beside her, quickly swallowed. Annie did not move. She sat very still and felt the hope she had carried in with her. Careful, quiet, stitched into copper thread. Go out like a candle in a closed room. She felt it leave cleanly, the way warmth leaves stone after a fire dies, and what remained was something colder and harder and entirely her own. She would not cry here. She would not make a sound. She reached beneath the table and pressed her fingers flat against her knee until the pressure was the only thing she felt, and she breathed, and she waited until the moment passed over her like a wave, and then she stood. "Where are you going?" Sela whispered. "Outside," Annie said. "I just need air." She moved along the edge of the hall, keeping to the shadow of the columns, keeping her spine straight and her chin level, because she was not going to give this room, or Lady Mora, who was watching her with an expression that was almost satisfied, the image of a woman who had been broken. She reached the side corridor that led toward the outer courtyard and pushed through the heavy door. The night air hit her like cold water, clean, real. She stood on the stone steps above the courtyard and pressed one hand against the wall, and finally let herself breathe without performance. Behind her, the door had not fully closed. She heard voices inside, 2 men she did not know, speaking low. And then she heard a third voice, quieter than the others, that made both of them go immediately silent. She turned. 3 men had followed her into the corridor without her noticing. Or perhaps they had already been there, moving through the castle by a different route. The first was tall and fair-haired, with a scar along his jaw and the look of someone who found most situations entertaining. The second was darker, broader, with a slow smile that suggested he was accustomed to attention. The third stood slightly behind them and said nothing at all. He was the one who had silenced the other two with a word she had not caught. He was also the one who was looking directly at her, not with pity, not with the mild curiosity that men sometimes showed toward women who were clearly out of place. With something steadier than that. Something that felt, unsettlingly, like recognition. The fair-haired man spoke first. "Leaving already? The assembly hasn't ended." "I'm aware," Annie said, keeping her voice even. "I needed air." The darker man tilted his head. "Funny. So did we." The third man still had not spoken. He was watching her with gray eyes that caught the torchlight from inside and held it. He wore no ceremonial armor, only dark wool and leather. But everything about how he stood in that doorway suggested that armor would have been redundant. Annie did not know his face, but something in her bones, something older than thought, had already taken a step back before she consciously registered why. Because whatever these men were, they were not middling alphas from Eastern Ridge villages, and the one with gray eyes had not stopped looking at her since she turned around. Annie held her ground on the stone steps, which was not easy when every instinct she possessed was quietly suggesting she take several steps backward. She had grown up around wolves. She understood hierarchy the way other people understood weather, as something that simply existed, that shaped every day whether you named it or not. And the hierarchy radiating from these three men was not the kind she had encountered at Lord Vane's table or in Lady Mora's drawing room. This was something older, something with weight behind it. The fair-haired man with the scar leaned one shoulder against the doorframe with the ease of someone who had never once worried about whether he belonged in a room. "You were sitting at the lower tables," he said. It was not an accusation. He said it the way someone might note the weather, observationally, without judgment. "I was," Annie confirmed. "And now you're out here." He glanced back at the hall briefly, then returned his gaze to her. "After the Vane boy made his choice." Annie felt something tighten in her chest, but kept her expression still. "I needed air," she repeated. "I said so." "You did." The fair-haired man smiled, and it was genuinely warm, which she had not expected. "I'm Doran. That is Rafe." He gestured toward the broader, darker man. "And behind me—" "She didn't ask," the gray-eyed man said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but quiet, in the way that very certain things are quiet, the way a drawn sword is quiet before it moves. Doran closed his mouth without apparent offense, which told Annie something significant about the nature of their dynamic. The gray-eyed man stepped past both of them and onto the top of the stone steps. He was taller than she had registered from inside the corridor, and broader through the shoulders, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had never needed to make himself appear more than he was. He stopped at a distance that was respectful, but not indifferent, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that she did not feel cornered. "You're not going to ask who I am," he said. It was not quite a question. "You said she didn't ask," Annie replied. "I was respecting the boundary." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a slight adjustment around the eyes that suggested the answer had been unexpected. "Aiden," he said. "My name is Aiden." She knew the name. Everyone in the kingdom knew the name. She simply had not connected it to a face, because the Alpha King was not supposed to be standing in a side corridor of Castle Duren, watching her breathe through a rejection on an ordinary assembly night. He was supposed to be in his seat of power in the north, governing a kingdom, signing treaties, doing whatever kings did when they were not appearing unexpectedly in doorways. Annie kept her face composed through the specific effort of will that years inside Lady Mora's house had made into something close to instinct. "My lord," she said, inclining her head. "King," Doran corrected helpfully from behind, and received what sounded like a low warning sound from Rafe for his trouble. "I know what he is," Annie said, without looking at Doran. Aiden was still watching her. "What is your name?" "Annie." "Annie," he repeated, as though weighing it. "Which pack?" This was the question she had always hated most. "None, currently. My mother was of the Grey Fen line. She died when I was 9. I've been under Lady Mora's household since." Something moved through his expression at that. Not pity, she noted with relief, but something more like the careful adjustment of information being filed precisely where it belonged. "The Grey Fen line," he said. "A minor one," she added, because people always said so, and she had learned to say it first. "Nothing significant." "That's one interpretation," he said. She looked at him more directly then, because that was an unusual thing to say. He met her gaze without any of the faint discomfort that men sometimes showed when a woman looked at them too steadily. He simply looked back, gray eyes level, as though he had all the time that existed and intended to use precisely as much of it as he chose. "You should go back inside," Annie said. "The assembly isn't finished. They'll notice an empty seat." "My seat is rarely where people expect it to be," Aiden said, "and the assembly will wait." Doran made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Rafe silenced him with an elbow. Annie pulled her shawl tighter against the night air and looked out over the courtyard below. Torches burned along the outer wall, and beyond the wall she could hear the forest, wind through heavy branches, the distant call of an owl, the particular deep silence that surrounded large gatherings of wolves like a held breath. The night smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and the first suggestion of autumn coming. "He wasn't worthy of you," Aiden said. She turned back to him sharply. "You don't know anything about me. I know you walked out of that hall with your spine straight and your chin level after being publicly discarded by a man who made you a private promise he had no intention of keeping." His voice had not changed in temperature or pace. "I know you're standing here now in a dress someone made for you with care, and you're not going to cry, and you're not going to go back inside and make a scene, and you're not going to let a single person in that hall have the satisfaction of seeing you diminished." He paused. "I know enough." Annie was quiet for a long moment. The torches crackled. Somewhere below in the courtyard, a horse shifted its weight and blew out a breath. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Not in the corridor." She meant the assembly. "The king does not typically attend the Duran gathering." "No," he agreed. "He doesn't." She waited. He did not elaborate, and she realized, studying him, that this was characteristic rather than evasive. He was a man who answered what was asked, and nothing beyond it, which meant that if she wanted the full answer, she would need to ask the full question, and she was not yet sure she wanted to do that. Sela appeared at the corridor door behind them, slightly breathless, her red curls fully escaping their braid now. She looked at Annie, then at the 3 men, then specifically at Aiden, and Annie watched the exact moment recognition arrived on her cousin's face. The slight widening of the eyes, the quick, controlled breath. "Annie," Sela said with admirable steadiness, "Lady Mora is asking for you." "Of course she is," Annie murmured. "You don't have to go," Doran offered. "She lives in that woman's house," Rafe said quietly, with the tone of someone who understood practical constraints. "She has to go." Annie looked at Aiden one last time. He had not moved, had not shifted his weight or looked away. There was something almost frustrating about how still he was, as though the world arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. "It was," she started. "Tomorrow," he said. She stopped. "I beg your pardon." There is a meeting of the Lords tomorrow morning in the East Hall. You will be there." It was not phrased as a question or an invitation. "I have no reason to attend a Lord's meeting," Annie said carefully. "I am not a lord." "You are a Gräfin," he said, "and I said you will be there." She studied him for a moment. The steadiness of his gaze, the complete absence of performance in the way he said it. It was not arrogance, she realized. Or not only arrogance. It was the specific confidence of someone who had looked at a situation from every available angle and reached a conclusion before most people had noticed there was a question. "I'll consider it," she said. Something shifted again in his expression, that almost adjustment near the eyes. "Consider it carefully," he said. Annie dipped her chin once. Not the full, formal inclination she had given him before, but something smaller and more honest. And then she turned and followed Sela back inside. Lady Mora found her before she had taken 20 steps back into the hall. Her aunt was not a tall woman, but she had a way of positioning herself that made her feel larger than she was. Shoulders back, chin lifted. The particular stillness of someone who had decided long ago that they were owed deference and had been receiving it ever since. Her burgundy gown gleamed dully in the torchlight. Her dark eyes moved over Annie with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. "What were you doing in the corridor?" she said. Not a question. "Getting air," Annie said, "as I told Sela." "You were speaking to men." "I was." "Men I did not recognize," Mora continued, and now there was something sharper beneath the surface of her voice. Not anger exactly, but the specific tension of someone who suspects they have missed something important and finds that intolerable. "Who were they?" Annie thought of gray eyes holding torchlight, of a quiet voice saying tomorrow as though it were already a fact. "Travelers," she said. "Passing through." Mora's eyes narrowed slightly. She was not stupid. She had not survived as long as she had in the lower rungs of nobility by being stupid. But she was also someone who had decided long ago exactly what Annie was, and had stopped looking closely enough to notice when that picture became inaccurate. "You embarrassed yourself tonight," Mora said, lowering her voice to the register she used when she wanted something to land precisely. "Sitting there expecting that vain boy to call your name. Did you truly think he would choose you? A girl with no pack, no dowry, no bloodline worth naming?" Annie said nothing. "I have told you," Mora continued, "more times than you deserve, that no alpha of standing will look at you and see a mate. You are here by my generosity. You eat at my table, sleep under my roof, wear dresses my niece sews for you, because she is soft-hearted and doesn't understand yet how the world works." She paused, letting that settle. "No man will want you, Annie. The sooner you accept that truth, the less you will humiliate yourself in rooms like this one." The words were familiar. Annie had heard variations of them for 14 years, and they had shaped her the way water shapes stone, not by breaking, but by gradual erosion, wearing smooth the places where resistance used to be. But tonight, standing in the torchlight of the great hall of Castle Duren, in a dress stitched with copper thread, with the memory of gray eyes still present in some part of her chest she could not quite name, they landed differently. Not because they hurt less, but because for the first time, she was not entirely certain they were true. "Good night, Aunt Mora," Annie said quietly, and walked away. She did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow room she shared with Sela in the castle's guest quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about Cedric, which hurt in the manageable way that expected things hurt. She thought about Petra Aldrin, standing straight and showing nothing on her face, and felt something close to kinship with a woman she had never spoken to. And then, because she could not stop it, she thought about the East Hall in the morning. Beside her, Sela's voice came softly through the dark. Who was he? The quiet one. Annie was silent for a moment. "Go to sleep, Sela." "Annie, go to sleep." Selah was quiet for a breath. Then, "His eyes didn't leave you once. Not once the whole time I was standing there." A pause. "I just thought you should know." Annie closed her eyes. She thought about it for a long time after Selah's breathing evened into sleep. About what it meant to be seen by eyes like that. About whether she was brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk into a Lord's meeting in the morning with no invitation, no status, and no certainty about what waited for her on the other side of that door. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to show at the narrow window, she had made her decision. The East Hall was smaller than the Great Hall, but no less imposing. It was a working room. Long table of dark oak down the center, maps weighted at the corners with iron stones, chairs that had been sat in by lords for generations, and showed it in the worn leather and darkened armrests. The walls held no decorative banners, only the mounted iron rings where torches burned clean and practical. Everything in the room said this is where decisions are made. And Annie felt the weight of that the moment she stepped through the door. She had dressed carefully. Not the green dress. That belonged to last night, and everything last night had meant, and she was not ready to carry it into a new morning. She wore her simplest good gown instead, gray wool with a plain linen collar, the kind of garment that said nothing except that the person wearing it had made a deliberate choice not to announce herself. Her dark hair was pinned back cleanly. She had no jewelry, no clan pin, nothing that would speak for her before she could speak for herself. Selah had wanted to come. Annie had told her no. The lords were already assembled when she arrived, 8 men around the table. Some she recognized from the previous night's gathering. Some she did not. Doran was there, leaning back in his chair with the same comfortable ease he had shown in the corridor. Rafe stood near the wall rather than sitting, arms crossed, watching the room with the particular alertness of someone whose function was to notice things before anyone else did. Aiden was at the head of the table. He was looking at a map when she entered, one hand resting flat against its surface. And he did not look up immediately. Several of the lords did, with expressions ranging from confusion to visible displeasure. One older man with a gray beard and a Haldren clan pin on his shoulder straightened in his chair and turned toward the door as though preparing to redirect her to the kitchens. "She stays," Aiden said, without looking up from the map. The older man closed his mouth. Annie walked to the far end of the room and stood near the wall, not taking a seat because she had not been offered one, and she understood the difference. Doran caught her eye from across the table and gave her a small nod that managed to be both welcoming and faintly amused. The meeting proceeded. It was, on its surface, about border arrangements. 3 packs in the Northern Territory had been encroaching on one another's claimed lands, and the tension had recently moved past the verbal stage into something that required the king's direct attention. The lords spoke in the careful language of men who were each trying to protect their own interests, while appearing to prioritize the kingdom's. Annie listened without moving. She had always been good at listening in rooms where no one expected her to matter. It was during the third speaker, Lord Fenwick, a thin man with restless hands, that she noticed something. He was describing the borders of the Eastern Ridge territories, and he was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in a way that would immediately damage the agreement being negotiated, but wrong in a specific detail about where the Grafen family's old land grant had placed the boundary of the Thornwall Forest. She knew this because her mother had told her, on one of the last clear evenings before the illness took her sharpness, drawing the lines in the dirt of their garden with a stick and explaining what each mark meant, and why it mattered, and why Annie should remember it, even if it never became relevant. "The land remembers even when the people forget," her mother had said, "and someday someone will need to know." Annie looked at the map on the table from across the room. She looked at Lord Fenwick's hands drawing shapes in the air that did not match what she knew. She looked at the men around the table, nodding slowly in the way people nod when they assume someone else knows better. And then she looked at Aiden. He was already looking at her. She did not know how long he had been watching her while she watched the room. His expression gave nothing away. It rarely seemed to. But his eyes were steady on her face with that same quality she had noticed the night before. The quality of paying genuine attention rather than performing it. She took one breath. Then she spoke. "The boundary Lord Fenwick is describing is incorrect," she said. Her voice was even. "The Thornwall Forest's eastern edge falls 12 chains further north than he's placed it. The Grayfen land grant from the 3rd generation set that line, and it was never formally revised. If you draw the border where he's suggesting, you'll place 2 of the contested settlements inside territory that technically belongs to a dormant Grayfen claim." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a woman has spoken where women were not expected to speak. Lord Fenwick turned to look at her with an expression that moved through surprise into something closer to offense. "And who, precisely, are you two?" "She is Annie of the Grayfen line," Aiden said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but Lord Fenwick stopped speaking immediately. "And she is correct." He stood from his chair then, which caused a subtle shift in the room's energy, the way air shifts before a storm, everyone present adjusting their posture without quite knowing why. He walked the length of the table to where the map lay and studied it for a moment, then moved one of the iron weights 12 chains north of where it had been, and the line it marked changed everything about the territorial negotiation they had been conducting for the past hour. "That changes Lord Aldrin's position considerably," the gray-bearded man said slowly. "Yes," Aiden agreed. "It does." He looked up at Annie from across the table. "Come and show me the rest." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the map. He was close enough that she was aware of it, the particular warmth of someone who carried authority like a physical thing. But he gave her room to work, stepping back half a pace and simply watching as she traced the old Grayfen boundaries from memory, her finger moving carefully across the map's surface. She explained each line as she drew it. She cited what she knew and marked clearly the places where her knowledge had gaps. She did not perform confidence she did not have, and she did not diminish the confidence she did have. When she finished, the room was different. She could feel it. The quality of attention had shifted, the way it shifts when people update an assessment without being willing to say so aloud. "Where did you learn this?" Rafe asked from the wall. He was looking at her with the focused expression of someone recalculating. "My mother," Annie said simply. "She believed in remembering things." "She was right," Aiden said. The meeting concluded an hour later. The lords filed out with the careful expressions of men who had more to think about than they had arrived with. Doran lingered near the door, and Rafe resumed his position just outside it, and Annie was gathering herself to leave when Aiden said her name. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. But it stopped her. She turned. They were alone in the East Hall now, the torchlight burning steady against stone walls, the map still spread across the dark oak table between them. "Sit," he said, pulling out the chair nearest her. She sat. He took the chair across the corner from her, rather than retreating to the head of the table, which put them at a conversational distance that felt deliberate. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at her with the same directness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things. Not an affectation, not an attempt at intimidation. Just attention. "Tell me about your mother," he said. The request was unexpected enough that she answered before she could decide whether to. She was Grayfen by birth and Calloway by marriage. She was a healer. She knew plants, injuries, fevers. She died of a winter sickness when I was 9. She was 31 years old. She paused. She was the most capable person I have ever known, and she spent her life being treated as though her capabilities were charming rather than significant. Something moved across his face, quiet and controlled, but real. "And after her death you went to Lady Mora." "She was my mother's sister by law," The closest living relative willing to take me. Willing, he repeated, catching the specific word. It's accurate, Annie said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map rather than at her, though she had the sense that he was not really seeing it. The Grayfen line is not minor, he said. Whatever Lady Mora told you, whatever this court has told you, that is not accurate. The Grayfen bloodline is one of the oldest in the kingdom. It predates most of the noble houses currently sitting at that table. He looked up. Your scent carries it. I knew it the moment you stepped into the corridor last night. Annie sat very still. That's why you were watching me. That's why I first noticed you, he said, with the particular precision of someone making a distinction. It is not why I kept watching. The torch nearest them crackled. Outside the narrow window, the morning sounds of the castle were beginning. Horses in the yard, the rhythmic clang from the smithy, voices calling across the courtyard in the business of an ordinary day. What happens now? Annie asked. That depends on you, Aiden said. I will not make decisions for your life without your participation. That is not how I intend to do things. He held her gaze. But I will tell you what I know. I came to this assembly because I received word 3 weeks ago that a woman of Grayfen blood was living as a dependent in Lady Mora's household, with no pack, no recognition, and no protection. Someone thought I should know. Annie felt something cold move through her. Who told you? He paused for the length of a breath. Someone who has been watching over you from a distance for longer than you know. That is a longer conversation, and you will have it when you are ready. He leaned forward slightly. What I want you to understand now is this. Last night you walked out of that hall with nothing that you came in with. Today you corrected a territorial error that 8 lords and their combined advisors had not caught. You are not what that room was told you were, Annie. You are not what Lady Mora told you that you were. His voice was steady and quiet, and carried the specific weight of something said not to impress, but to inform. And I intend to make certain that is no longer something anyone in this kingdom can ignore. The silence that followed was the kind that needs to be sat in rather than filled. Annie looked at the man across the table, the king who had ridden to an assembly he had no formal reason to attend, who had stood in a corridor in the dark and said tomorrow like it was already decided, who had moved an iron weight on a map and changed the shape of a negotiation because a woman with no title had spoken the truth. And she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope this time. Something steadier than hope. Something that did not require the same faith because it had already begun to show her evidence. You said the longer conversation will come when I'm ready, she said. Yes. I'm ready now, she said. For the first time since she had met him, something that was unmistakably a smile reached Aiden's eyes. The longer conversation took place in the castle's small walled garden, which in autumn held more stone than flower, but had the advantage of open sky and no doors behind which ears could press themselves. Aiden walked beside her without ceremony. No guards trailing at a formal distance, only Rafe visible at the garden's entrance, far enough away to be discreet. Doran had apparently been sent elsewhere, which Annie suspected was a deliberate choice on Aiden's part. Whatever was about to be said did not require an audience, even a friendly one. They walked one full circuit of the garden path before either of them spoke, and Annie found she did not mind the silence. It was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of 2 people who were each deciding how much to say and finding gradually that the answer was more than they had initially intended. Aiden spoke first. Your mother did not die only of a winter sickness, he said. Annie stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and his voice remained level, not cold, but careful in the way of someone delivering something heavy and wanting to do it cleanly. She was weakened by it, yes, but the Grayfen bloodline carries a natural resilience to illness that should have allowed her to survive what she contracted. Something accelerated her decline. something that should not have been present in a healthy woman of 31. He looked at her steadily. My father's advisors were aware of this at the time. They chose not to investigate. Why? Annie's voice was quieter than she intended. Because an investigation would have required acknowledging that the Grafen line was significant enough to warrant protecting, he said. And there were people in this kingdom who preferred that line to remain unacknowledged. Small, overlooked, easy to dismiss. He paused. Your mother was not an accident of illness, Annie. She was a threat that someone decided to remove quietly. The garden was very still around them. The morning light fell flat and pale through thin clouds, and the smell of cold stone and dying herb stalks rose from the beds on either side of the path. Annie looked at a cluster of frost-browned rosemary and made herself breathe through the thing that was happening in her chest. Not grief, exactly, because grief for her mother had been processed in the long years of a childhood spent learning to carry it. This was something different. This was the specific pain of a story you thought you knew, revealing a second layer. Who sent you the information about me? She asked. Her voice had steadied. A woman named Ilara, he said. She was your mother's closest companion before her marriage. After your mother died, she withdrew from court entirely and has lived in the Thornwall villages for the past 14 years. He watched Annie's face carefully. She has been sending reports, irregular, careful, through intermediaries, about your situation in Lady Mora's house. When the most recent one reached me, I decided it required a direct response. Annie turned this over. Ilara. She did not know the name, but the idea of it, a woman she had never met, watching over her from a distance through 14 years of quiet letters, made something ache in her throat. She knew my mother. She loved your mother, Aiden said simply, and she has been trying, within her limited means, to fulfill a promise she made to her. What promise? That if anything happened, she would make sure you were not left entirely alone. He looked at the sky for a moment, then back at her. She has not been able to do much, but she did one significant thing. She made sure I knew you existed. Annie was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the garden held its autumn stillness, and somewhere beyond the wall, a crow called once and went silent. Why does my bloodline matter so much? She asked. You said it predates the noble houses, but there are old bloodlines throughout the kingdom that no one pays particular attention to. The Grafen line does not only carry age, Aiden said. It carries a specific quality that appears rarely even within the bloodline itself, a capacity for what our oldest texts call true reading, the ability to perceive what is real beneath what is presented. In practical terms, it means Grafen wolves have historically been impossible to deceive in meaningful ways. They see through performance, through constructed loyalty, through false alliance. He looked at her with an expression that was measuring, and something else she could not quite name. It is why you noticed Cedric Vane's intention before last night. You simply did not trust what you perceived. Annie thought about the market morning 6 weeks ago. The way Cedric had walked beside her and said the right things, and she had felt, beneath the warmth of it, a faint, persistent wrongness she had dismissed as her own insecurity. She thought about the way she had read every room she had ever entered from the edges, cataloging faces and currents and unspoken dynamics, and how she had always assumed this was merely the habit of someone who could not afford to be caught off guard. I thought I was just careful, she said. You are careful, he agreed. You are also Grafen. He paused. The two are not unrelated. They had begun walking again without either of them deciding to, falling back into a slow circuit of the path. The conversation had changed something in the air between them, made it denser, more charged, the way air feels before lightning without the threat. What is it that you intend? Annie asked directly. You said last night you would make certain I could no longer be ignored. What does that mean in practical terms? Aiden was quiet for 3 paces. It means several things. he said finally. First, the dormant Greyfen claim we identified this morning will be formally reinstated. That gives you legal standing as the line's last living descendant. It is not a title of nobility in the traditional sense, but it places you above the position of a household dependent with no rights and no protection. That alone will cause problems, Annie said. Yes, he agreed, without apparent concern. It will cause problems primarily for the people who benefited from you having no standing. I consider that acceptable. And second? She asked. He looked at her then, directly, and without the slight buffer that people usually maintained in conversations about things that mattered. Second, he said, I would like you to remain at court, not as a dependent, not as a guest, as someone whose counsel I intend to use, whose presence I intend to make known, and whose situation I intend to regularize through whatever means are appropriate, and with your full agreement at every step. He paused. I am not Cedric Vane. I do not make private promises and dissolve them when they become inconvenient. If I say something to you, Annie, I mean it, and I will still mean it when there are witnesses. The directness of it should have been overwhelming. It was, she realized, not overwhelming because of the last part, with your full agreement at every step. He had included that without being asked, without framing it as a concession. He had included it because it was simply how he understood the situation to work. You barely know me, she said. I know what I have observed, he said. I know what 14 years of Alara's reports describe. I know what your bloodline carries and what it means. And I know what I perceived when you walked into that hall last night and what I perceived when you spoke in that meeting this morning. He held her gaze steadily. I am not asking you to trust me fully on the basis of 2 days. I am asking you to remain long enough to decide whether trust is warranted. It was, Annie thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. They were interrupted by Doran, who appeared at the garden entrance with the expression of a man delivering news he found personally entertaining. My lord, he said, addressing Aidan while clearly looking at Annie. Lady Mora has formally requested an audience. She appears to have learned something that has given her strong feelings. Annie felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, the specific physical response her body had developed to Lady Mora's name, and made herself release it deliberately. She was not in that house. She was not at that table. She did not have to arrange her face into careful blankness before she was permitted to exist in her own space. Where is she? Aidan asked. Waiting in the reception hall, Doran said. With that expression she has. The one that means she believes she is owed an explanation. Aidan looked at Annie. You don't have to be present for this. I know, Annie said. I want to be. Something moved in his expression. Approval, she thought, though he kept it restrained. He nodded once, and they walked back into the castle together. Lady Mora was standing in the center of the reception hall when they entered, and Annie could read immediately that her aunt had not yet understood the full shape of what she had walked into. She had come prepared for a certain kind of conversation, the kind where she was the aggrieved party arriving to reclaim something that had gone outside its proper boundaries. The burgundy gown was still immaculate. Her posture was still the posture of a woman who expected deference. Then Aidan walked through the door, and Lady Mora went very still. My Lord King, she said, after a pause that lasted precisely 1 beat too long. Lady Mora, Aidan said. He did not stop walking until he had reached the chair at the head of the small receiving table, and he sat in it not with ceremony but with the particular settled quality of someone who understands that every room they enter is already theirs. I understand you wanted to speak about your niece. Mora's eyes moved to Annie, standing a few feet to Aidan's right, and something passed through them. Confusion first, then a rapid recalculation, then the careful smoothing of expression that meant she was adjusting her approach in real time. I wanted to ensure her welfare, Mora said carefully. She is young and inexperienced, and I would not want her to find herself in a situation she does not fully understand." "That is considerate," Aidan said, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely unconvinced. "Tell me, Lady Mora, how long has Annie been in your household?" "Since she was 9 years old," Mora said. "We have cared for her since her mother's passing." "Cared for her," he repeated. "And in 14 years of care, did you know that she was the last living descendant of the Grafen bloodline with a valid land claim in the Northern Territories?" The silence that followed had a specific quality. It was the silence of someone who did know and was calculating how much that knowledge would cost them now. "The Grafen line was considered dormant," Mora said carefully. "Considered by whom?" Aidan asked. Mora did not answer. "The claim has been reinstated as of this morning," Aidan said. "Annie's status as its heir is being formally documented. She will no longer require the shelter of your household, and she will no longer be subject to your authority." He held Mora's gaze with the same steady gray eyes he turned on everything. "I want to be precise about something, Lady Mora. The way Annie has been spoken to in your house, the way she has been made to understand her own worth, I am aware of it, in detail." A pause. "I would encourage you to consider, going forward, what it means to have treated carelessly something that others value greatly." Lady Mora's face had gone the color of old ash. She looked at Annie once, and Annie met her gaze with the steadiness she had spent years building. And then she looked away first. "Of course, my Lord King," Mora said quietly. "Good," he said. "That will be all." Annie watched her aunt leave the room. She watched the door close behind that burgundy gown, behind 14 years of careful diminishment, behind every version of "no man will want you." That had been said in varying tones and circumstances until she had almost believed it. Almost. She became aware that Aidan was watching her again, from the chair at the head of the table, and she turned to look at him. He did not ask if she was all right. She found she was grateful for that. She was all right, and she did not need the question, and he seemed to have understood both things without requiring them to be stated. "Doran," he said, without looking away from her. "My lord?" Doran's voice came from just outside the door. "Send word to Alara in the Thornwall villages. Tell her that Annie is with me. Tell her she kept her promise." A pause. Then Doran's voice quietly. "Yes, my lord." Annie looked at the man across the room, the king who had ridden to a gathering no one expected him to attend, who had moved a weight on a map and changed the shape of a negotiation, who had faced down her aunt with nothing louder than a steady voice. And she felt the last careful distance she had been maintaining begin, very slowly, to close. The message to Alara was sent before midday, carried by one of Aidan's personal messengers on a fast horse toward the Thornwall villages. Annie watched the rider leave from the castle's upper corridor window and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. The particular quiet of a thing that has been unresolved for years finally finding its shape. Sela found her there an hour later, red curls fully surrendered to chaos, eyes wide with the expression of someone who had been collecting information all morning and was close to bursting with it. "Tell me everything," Sela said. Annie told her. Not everything. Some things were still too new and too carefully held to be spoken aloud without losing their shape. But enough. Enough that Sela sat down on the stone window bench halfway through and did not get up again, listening with her hands pressed flat against her knees and her eyes moving through surprise, grief, fury on Annie's behalf, and finally something that looked very much like relief. When Annie finished, Sela was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother knew." "I think so," Annie said. "I think she taught me everything she could in the time she had, and hoped it would be enough." "It was," Sela said simply. Annie looked out the window at the courtyard below, where the ordinary life of the castle continued. Servants crossing with bundles, a blacksmith's apprentice leading a horse toward the smithy, 2 guards changing position at the outer gate. ordinary and ancient and entirely indifferent to the fact that her life had shifted on its foundation in the space of a single night and morning. "What will you do?" Sela asked. "Stay," Annie said. The word came without hesitation, which told her something about how thoroughly she had already decided. "For now, I stay." Sela nodded slowly, and then, because she was Sela, she reached out and straightened the collar of Annie's gray gown with the brisk affection of someone who shows love through small practical gestures. "Then I stay too," she said. "Someone has to make sure you eat when you're thinking too hard." Annie laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that surprised her by arriving. And for a moment the corridor was warm, despite the autumn cold pressing through the stone. 3 days passed in the way that consequential days sometimes do, full of small moments that only reveal their significance in retrospect. Aiden did not rush her. He had said he would not, and he kept that as he kept everything, without drama, without requiring acknowledgement. They met each morning in the East Hall, initially under the pretext of the territorial documentation that the reinstated Grafen claim required, and then less and less under any pretext at all. He asked her questions, and listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who was not waiting for his turn to speak. She asked him questions in return, and found, gradually, that he answered them with the same directness he applied to everything. She learned that he had taken the throne at 22 after his father's prolonged decline, that he had spent the years since building a kingdom that worked through law rather than through fear, and that this had made him respected by some and resented by many. She learned that Duran was his cousin and had been his closest companion since childhood, and that Rafe had served his family for 15 years and was the person he trusted most completely. She learned that he slept little and read much, and had opinions about territorial governance that were genuinely interesting once she stopped being surprised that a king held opinions at all. He learned that she had memorized her mother's knowledge of plants and healing as a way of staying close to a woman she had lost too young. That she had developed the habit of reading rooms from the edges, not only from instinct but from necessity. That she had spent 14 years being told what she was not, and that it had left in her a permanent, bone-deep attention to what was true versus what was merely repeated until it felt true. On the 4th morning, Cedric Vane appeared. He came to the East Hall during the documentation session, which meant he walked in to find Annie seated at the table across from the Alpha King with maps between them and Rafe present at the wall. And the expression that crossed his face in that first unguarded moment was something Annie filed away carefully and chose not to dwell on. It was recognition. Not of her specifically, but of what he had miscalculated and what that miscalculation had cost him. He addressed Aiden first, as protocol required, and Aiden received him with perfect courtesy and no warmth whatsoever. Then Cedric looked at Annie. "I wanted to speak with you," he said. His voice had lost the easy confidence she remembered from the market morning. "To explain." "There is nothing to explain," Annie said. Not unkindly, not coldly either. Simply with the clarity of someone who had processed a thing and emerged from the other side of it without residue. "You made a choice that was right for your family and your position. I understand it. Annie, I genuinely wish you and Petra Aldrin well," she said, and meant it, which was perhaps the most surprising thing about the whole exchange, that she meant it completely. She had no anger left for Cedric Vane. He had simply been the wrong person, and she had almost made the mistake of not knowing that. He left shortly after, and the room returned to its working quiet. And Aiden said nothing about the exchange until much later that evening, when they were walking the garden path, in the cold last light of the day. "You meant it," he said, "about wishing him well." "Yes," Annie said. "Most people wouldn't. Most people would still be angry," she agreed. "I think I used up my anger on the larger things. He was just a lesson in paying attention to what I already knew." Aiden was quiet for a moment. Then, What did you already know? She thought about it honestly. That he was telling me what I wanted to hear, she said, and that what I wanted to hear at the time was that I was worth choosing. I wanted it badly enough to believe a version of it that wasn't real. She paused. I don't want that anymore. I want what is real, even when it's harder. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, and when she looked up at him in the fading light, he was watching her with the expression she had first seen in the corridor on the assembly night. That quality of recognition, of something being confirmed rather than discovered. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of dark hair away from her face with a careful, deliberate hand, and the gesture was so quiet and so precise that it landed somewhere deeper than any grand declaration could have. I have something to tell you, he said, and I want to tell it to you now, before anything else is decided or formalized or made official. Tell me, she said. When Alara's first letter reached me 3 weeks ago, I read it and set it aside, he said. I told myself it was a political matter, a bloodline to be reinstated, a situation to be corrected. I told myself that was the reason I came to Duren. He held her gaze steadily. I knew by the end of the first evening that I had been dishonest with myself. Whatever I came here to correct, what I found was something I was not expecting and did not have a political category for. A pause. I am not a man who speaks carelessly, Annie. I want you to understand that before I say what I am going to say. I know, she said quietly. And she did know. She had learned that about him in 4 days, the way she had learned rooms in an instant, through accumulated attention. Stay, he said. Not for the Grayfen claim, not for the court or the politics or any formal arrangement. Stay because I would like to know you fully, and because I know, that what I see when I look at you is real and rare and worth every complication it will cause. The garden was very still. Cold air, stone paths, the last amber light draining from the western sky. Annie looked at the man in front of her, steady and serious and completely without performance. And she thought about her mother drawing lines in garden dirt and saying the land remembers, even when the people forget. She thought about a copper-threaded dress, and a hope she had carried into the wrong room. She thought about how different it felt to stand in the right one. I already said I would stay, she reminded him. You said for now, he replied. She held his gaze. Then I'll say it differently. She took a breath. I'll stay. What followed was neither swift nor simple because real things rarely are. The Grayfen claim was formally reinstated before the assembly concluded, documented in the kingdom's official records, and witnessed by 8 lords, several of whom had the grace to look appropriately humbled. Annie's name was entered into the court registry as the line's living heir, which gave her legal standing, her own household allowance, and the right to a seat at any territorial council where Grayfen lands were discussed. It was not everything at once. It was a foundation, and foundations are built before walls. Alara arrived from the Thornwall villages 6 days after the messenger reached her. A small, silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, and her mother's same quality of seeing clearly without announcing it. When she walked into the room where Annie was waiting, neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, Alara crossed the distance between them and took Annie's face in both hands, the way a person does when they are looking at something they feared they might never see. And Annie understood in that moment the full weight of 14 years of careful watching from a distance, of letters sent through intermediaries, of a promise kept through every year of silence. She would be so proud of you, Alara said, and her voice only broke on the last word. Annie held on to her for a long time. Sela remained at court, as she had said she would, and found within a month that she had opinions about the castle's herb garden management that the head gardener found either infuriating or refreshing depending on the day. She and Doran developed an acquaintance built on mutual entertainment at each other's expense that everyone around them found either exhausting or charming, also depending on the day. Lady Mora returned to her estate on the eastern road, and was not heard from in any significant way again. The world continued without her commentary, which it turned out was entirely capable of doing. Cedric Vane married Petra Aldrin at Winter's End in a ceremony that was spoken of as appropriate and well-arranged. Annie, when she heard, thought of a woman standing very straight and showing nothing on her face, and genuinely hoped she was happy. Aidan courted Annie with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he brought to everything, through winter councils and cold garden walks and long evenings in the East Hall where maps gave way to conversation that had nothing to do with territorial lines. He was never careless with her. He never once made her feel that his interest required her to be smaller or quieter, or less than what she was. He chose her, plainly and publicly, and repeatedly, in every small way that actual choosing is made, not once in a grand gesture, but daily, in the accumulation of 100 consistent moments. By spring, it was known throughout the kingdom. By summer, it was formal. By the following autumn, 1 year after a copper-threaded dress and a torchlit corridor and a gray-eyed king who said tomorrow like it was already a fact, Annie of the Grayfen line stood beside Aidan in the great hall of the Northern Keep, before lords and pack leaders and witnesses from every corner of the kingdom, and she was claimed not as a dependent, not as a political arrangement, not as a corrected oversight, but as a chosen mate and equal by a king who meant every word he said. She wore green. Sela had insisted on it. And this time, when she walked into the hall carrying something in her chest that felt like hope, it was not fragile. It had been tested and proven and built on ground that held. It was not a wish. It was a truth she had learned the way her mother had taught her to learn things. Through attention, through patience, through trusting what she perceived even when the world told her she was wrong. She was not wrong. She had never been wrong. She had simply been waiting for the right eyes to confirm what she already knew.